Hello, and welcome to our third lesson. As the title indicates, you can consider this the second part of a series where we discuss the way in which the fall of Troy impacted, at least the fall of Troy as it was depicted in the Greek oral tradition and mythology, the way it impacted um, future pieces of literature, such as the Odyssey, which we looked at this time, and the Aeneid, which we're looking at for today's lesson. Again, I'll just remind you that the Battle of Troy that's depicted in the Iliad, in the Greek oral tradition, and other Greek works is not a real battle, but loosely based on a series of real conflicts between the Greeks and parts of Asia Minor. But it became such a well-known story in the Greek oral tradition that it kind of took on a life of its own, and then once Homer wrote the Iliad and depicted some of the events from the Battle of Troy, it really became something almost historical, the cultural significance it's had. And as we saw last time, Odysseus' journey home after the Trojan War is certainly one example of that. Today we see another example with the Aeneid, which is Virgil's epic poem, his most well-known work, and also probably certainly the most well-known work of ancient Rome, and probably one of the most well-known works written in Latin. It's considered the national epic of Rome, and at the time it was composed, Rome was very concerned with its origins and its founding. So it's about the protagonist Aeneas founding the first Roman city. But Aeneas himself is a survivor of the Trojan War. He has a very small part in Homer's The Iliad, and so in many ways, Virgil's drawing on this tradition that came before him. Hence, we have the title of this lesson. And here we have a depiction of Aeneas leaving Troy as it's burning after the Greeks have sacked it, with his wife and his son and his father. Only his son and his father make it out with him. His wife dies, as you know if you did the reading and read book 2. But I think this picture really captures the destruction of Troy that's so prominent in that second book. So the recall questions this time, I ask for you to think about the major themes from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Virgil really draws on these works when composing the Aeneid, so it'd be good to have some of those themes we talked about last time in mind. Well, really the last 2 lessons in mind. That's part of it. He draws on both the Iliad and the Odyssey, not just the Odyssey, even though this work has the closest parallels to the Odyssey. He's really drawing on both these works when he composes the Aeneid. So things such as pride, death, proper burial rites, other things like honor and glory and vengeance that are wrapped up as part of Greek pride. Excuse me. Family, relationships, vengeance, all of these things that we discussed with both of those works. Travel, exile, relating to other people. Now I'm saying some of the ones from the Odyssey. So take a minute and note those, and then as we go through the lesson, think back or think to your reading and think about how do these themes show up in the Aeneid, but also how does Virgil add new things? What does he bring into the Aeneid that's not part of the Iliad and the Odyssey? As you'll see as this class progresses, which is why I have the recall questions, later works build on earlier ones. So the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed around the 8th century BCE, and they were born out of the Greek oral tradition, which had existed for 500 years prior. Virgil writes the Aeneid in the 1st century BCE, so roughly 700 years after the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he's drawing on these works, and he owes a lot to them, but he introduces new things as well. And that's how literature works. These pieces we're studying are considered masterpieces in that they're influential beyond their time. And if we look at them in sequential order, we'll see how literature has shaped Western society over the time. Going back to the main focus of the class, the purpose of the class. So think about how Virgil incorporates some of the same themes, like the ones I just listed, but also introduces new ones. Here's the historical background on Virgil and how he composed the Aeneid, which is really rather interesting. He was born in a rural part of northern Italy, which I think easily goes overlooked. You know, the Greeks were so known for their prominent cities. Sparta and Athens, and Greek mythology is so prominent, so popular, that I think Roman mythology kind of gets overshadowed by the Iliad and the Odyssey a little bit. And certainly the notion that Virgil was from a small kind of rural area does as well. In fact, his earlier poetry shows this appreciation for the countryside. Before the Aeneid, he composed two other shorter but still narrative poems about farming. And one of those even features the protagonist, a farmer, trying to rebuild his farm after a storm, which, although very different from the Aeneid, parallels the struggles, some of the themes there. The Aeneid is very much about building a home. And Virgil considers that a very valuable, passionate human struggle, and that appears all throughout his poetry, whether he's showing nostalgia for the countryside or crafting this grand epic that you read parts of for the assigned reading for this lesson. During his life, he witnessed an enormous amount of change in the Roman Empire. It was one of the biggest empires in the world, second only to the British Empire that reached its height in the 19th and early 20th century. But aside from that British Empire, Rome was known for being the largest empire in terms of the amount of territory it covered in the history of the world. And when it was really expanding and taking in all this new territory, that happened during Virgil's life. But when you're expending all these resources and building, expanding your territory, that often creates instability at home. Fewer resources devoted to, managing the kingdom at home. And so Virgil certainly witnessed those effects, being from a small kind of rural community. Rome, in contrast to the ancient Greece, was known for being a republic, where they didn't have just one ruler or one dictator. An early version of what we now consider democracy. However, this started to change during Virgil's time. All of the different imperial victories really shifted the power toward the military, and one of its generals, Julius Caesar, seized control of the empire and declared himself its first dictator. So it eventually did shift from this republic I just mentioned to a dictatorship, and that happened during Virgil's lifetime. But Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE when Virgil was 26. And that led to over a decade of civil wars and even more internal strife, until 12 years after the assassination, Caesar's adopted great-nephew, Octavian, defeated his rivals, Antony and Cleopatra, and took control of Rome. So if you know a little bit of that history, Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian was the one who'd worked with them, and then eventually they kind of all turned on each other, and he defeated them and took control. When he took control, though, he wanted singular rule. He wanted to be the sole ruler of Rome, but he didn't want to end up with the same fate as Caesar. He didn't want to be assassinated, so he became very concerned with his public image, and he started calling himself Augustus instead of Octavius, and he really preached the notion of a republic. He tried to get people to think that Rome was going back to being a republic, and he managed to keep up that illusion, even though he really was a dictator type of figure. I mean, that word has a negative connotation, but he was the sole leader, I guess a monarchy, although it wasn't a divine kind of thing. He was the sole ruler. But he got people to think it was a republic again, and this name Augustus kind of disassociated him from Caesar. To help with his public image, he kept a close relationship to all the prominent writers, and so that way he kind of knew what they were writing and if they were maintaining his image the way he wanted them to. And he very good friends with Virgil, and he even commissioned Virgil to write a national epic that would glorify, justify the imperial mission of Augustan Rome. And the work he ended up with was the Aeneid, but Virgil composed it over a long period of time. I think it may not have even been completely finished when he died. I'd have to check on that. But either way, it was this long, complex work, and so it's self-contradictory. It's complex and intricate. Um, it's not a literary work that's easy to pin down. So whether or not Augustus was actually happy with it is very debatable, and that's one of the things we'll discuss in the questions. But what's important to take away from that is this notion of nationality, of nationhood, of building a nation. Um, since the time of Virgil and the writing of the Aeneid, the epic, as we've seen it so far in the Iliad and the Odyssey, took on another layer. Just as the Odyssey showed more psychological depth in the main character from the Iliad, again, the Aeneid builds on the tradition, and here it adds this sense of nationalism. From this point on, the genre of the epic is usually associated with this kind of nationalistic focus of being a grand, powerful poem that represents the ideals and values of a nation. And we'll see that again later in the course when we look at the Song of Roland, which is considered the national epic of France. So I have just the first reading question here. I want to revisit the other reading question when we get to the pedagogical or learning slide. And here I talk about what I iterated earlier, that Virgil borrowed a great deal from the Greeks and the Romans, and especially from Homer. And so this is the question I asked earlier. What are some similarities and differences between the Aeneid and the Iliad and the Odyssey? What has Virgil added and what does he keep? He really has elements of both, because if you think about the plot, and I don't have a slide this time on the plot, but it's about a survivor of the Trojan War wandering around the Mediterranean. The first half of it is. The first 6 books are about that. And so that's really similar to the Odyssey, right? And the key difference, though, between this text and the Odyssey is that Aeneas doesn't have a home. He's not trying to return home and reclaim his home. His home has been destroyed. And so while the first half of the poem parallels the Odyssey in that sense, the second half, he lands in Italy and he fights against the indigenous inhabitants, the Latins, eventually defeating them and founding Rome. Well, excuse me, not Rome, founding a city that is like the first city of the Roman Empire. In mythology, Romulus and Remus founded Rome. And Virgil founded a city prior to that that's considered the first Roman city. So the first 6 books really have a lot of similarities to the Odyssey, and the other 6 books, 7 through 12, really have a lot of similarities to the Iliad. The first 6 books are about a man on a journey trying to find a home, and the other 6 books are about warfare, fighting for one's home, you could say. So he draws on both of those. Some important differences, or one really important difference, I would say, is coming back to this theme of nation building. Virgil's not trying to get back to, Aeneas isn't trying to get back to his home, he's trying to build a home. And so this was something we haven't really seen yet. Something kind of close to it with Odysseus trying to reclaim his home, but that's not the same thing as founding a nation. And you also have a theme of fall and rise that's similar. You know, his home is destroyed and he's a nomad, he's wandering, he's an exile, but then he's eventually able to find a new place and fight for it and build something there. So you see the fall of Troy, but the rise of Rome in this poem. And so nation building and fall and rise, I would say, are 2 new themes, while a man on a journey and a man in war are 2 themes he's borrowed from the Odyssey and the Iliad, respectively. All right, here are some questions again for you that I think really get at the themes, the content of the work, the most important parts. Aeneas is the protagonist. I think it's always good to open with a question about the protagonist. Who is this main character? What is he like? And because we're reading these things historically, chronologically, how is he built on these previous protagonists? How is he similar to them? but also have new layers. So really similar to the last question, but focusing in on the protagonist. Uh, Here I would say you see some similarities. He's a great warrior. He's a good leader. So he's a warrior like Achilles, but he's a leader like Odysseus. Um, One key difference, I would say, is that he's very dutiful. He really follows his duty, um, which is a newer idea, right? Achilles really shirks his duty. I mean, he does not obey Agamemnon. He has to obey the gods, but he's always questions that, is kind of reluctant, challenges it some before he eventually obeys. Um, and Odysseus is a king himself, so he's obedient to the gods, but sometimes he's prideful, like when he gloats to the Cyclops and angers Poseidon. So there's not the same sense of duty in the Iliad and the Odyssey that you see here in the Aeneid. And that's one key difference between Aeneas and these earlier protagonists. Aeneas is very dutiful to the gods, which we see in Book 4 when he's in love with Dido, but he still chooses to leave Carthage and continue on his mission that's foreordained from the beginning to found the first Roman city. So why would Virgil bring in this notion of duty that's not present in the earlier texts? The big difference is, if we think about why the text was composed, he was commissioned by Augustus in order to make this national epic, whereas Homer was trying to preserve the legends that had been part of the oral tradition. Here, Virgil's drawing on a different, much earlier culture's oral tradition to create a new epic for his own country. And so Augustus would certainly want his citizens to be loyal. And so this notion of duty that Aeneas follows really plays into that. And if we're thinking about some differences between Aeneas, not just new things that have been added by Virgil, but some differences between Achilles and Odysseus, we can transition to the second question here. Book 2 is really interesting because it depicts the battle, the final battle at Troy, where Troy falls, and it really shows the fall of Troy. It shows the city burning and Aeneas trying to escape, which is a pretty powerful passage. But we don't actually see that in the Iliad. Remember, the Iliad begins, even though it begins in the final year of the war, the poem still concludes with Achilles' conversation with Priam months before the war ends. So we don't see this final battle in the Iliad. But it was well known from Greek oral tradition and Greek mythology, and so Aeneas knew that and drew on it and decided to depict it, but in a very different way. You wouldn't see it depicted this way in a Greek text. The Greeks are vilified here. He does stay very close to the Homeric representations in some senses, because there were all these different versions in the oral tradition, and Homer's just the one that's lasted because he wrote it down. But for instance, something that's unique to Homer's version of events is the conversation between Achilles and Priam that concludes the Iliad. And Aeneas maintains that throughout Book 2. Achilles is portrayed in kind of a positive way, especially when Priam dies, and there are passages of dialogue there that show Priam kind of saying, at least Achilles treated me right. Whereas Odysseus is portrayed in a very negative way. So now one thing you have to keep in mind here is that Odysseus is called Ulysses. In Latin, which would be the language of the Romans rather than Greek, Odysseus' name is translated to Ulysses. And like I said last time, the Odyssey is a text that's referenced and retold a lot throughout the Western canon and even in other parts of the world, all kinds of literature. For some reason, when the Odyssey is retold or referenced later on, the name Ulysses is used more often, the Latin name, to refer to the character of Odysseus. I think that's because Latin is a language that survived longer, and also because Ulysses is a little bit easier to say than Odysseus. It's fewer syllables. But anyway, when we see this battle in Book 2 and we see the fall of Troy, Achilles is portrayed in a fairly positive way because Aeneas is drawing on the Iliad, where Homer depicts Achilles having that conversation with Priam and giving him the body back. But Odysseus or Ulysses is known for the Trojan horse, which led to the downfall of Troy. And so Ulysses or Odysseus is really vilified here. You got to remember, and I probably should have mentioned this more earlier, but Virgil is drawing on the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he's telling the story from the perspective of a Trojan. So the Greeks are going to appear like villains here. And in Greek mythology, in the oral tradition, Ulysses designed the Trojan horse that led to the fall of Troy. And because it's a trick or deception, he's really vilified here as a schemer and a trickster. What's interesting about that is the Greeks really valued cunningness and strategy. And we saw how those things were considered very heroic in the Odyssey. So that leads to an interesting question. Is cunningness and being strategic, using deception as part of combat, is that something that the Romans no longer value? In a big way they differ from the Greeks? Or is it simply because this is from a Trojan's perspective and that's why Ulysses is vilified? But if the heroic characters, if the Trojans or the Romans are using deception, then it's fine. That's the question. Is it a matter of a positive or negative view of deception, or is it just whose perspective the story is told from? That's not a question I'm going to answer right now. I think that's a good question for you to kind of think about and chew on later on. Like I said, I'll answer these questions in more detail when we go through the lessons than the learning questions, because these get at the content, the meaning of the text, whereas the learning questions get at why the text is important. So those are the ones I want you to address, pick one and address on Canvas. But I do think this is too complex of a question for me to just answer here for you. Do the Romans value cunning and strategy or not? So think about that. Moving on to some other important aspects of the text, Dido is one of the most important figures. Aeneas is clearly the protagonist, but you could make the argument that Dido is the most interesting character in the entire thing. Throughout this course, she's the first strong female character we've seen, because female characters barely have a presence in the Iliad. They have more of a presence in the Odyssey, but their roles are very limited. They're either vilified, like Agamemnon's wife, or they're idealized for being completely virtuous, like Odysseus' wife, Penelope. We don't necessarily have a positive view of femininity in the Aeneid, but we certainly have a more complex one, with a figure like Dido who really plays a major role in the text, especially in these early books that I assigned for the reading. And so I do have a pedagogical question about her, so we'll come back to her. But she's this very tragic figure. If you read it, you know her backstory, so I'm not going to go through all of that now. But she's this very tragic figure because she comes from a tragic background, where she has lost her husband to her greedy brother, and has had to flee her home and is trying to build a new home in Carthage. So her story is very similar to Aeneas's. They have some parallels in that she's lost her previous home and trying to build a new home. Also, she's from the East. She's from Africa, rather than the West. Rather than Rome or Greece, she's from Africa. Carthage is located in Africa. So this West versus East dichotomy enters into the equation. And that way she parallels Cleopatra quite a bit. Aeneas's relationship with Dido could be kind of a literary representation of Antony's relationship with Cleopatra. At least for Roman readers reading it at the time Virgil composed it, that's what would come to their minds. And this leads me into the fourth and final question here. By evoking Antony and Cleopatra, Virgil is able to evoke Rome's recent history. As Rome was expanding, like I said earlier, Carthage was one of their main opponents that they defeated not long before he composed the Aeneid, but a while. And so this whole scene in books 1, 2, and 4 in Carthage with Dido really would evoke Rome's recent wars with Carthage for the readers. And this creates a very interesting view of history, because Dido is just beginning to found her city. And so it's kind of a temporal paradox. Virgil's alluding to things, telling things that are very similar to something that happened in Rome's past, but in the actual text itself, that history is just beginning. And so the way Virgil plays with time is interesting. He wants to evoke certain things in the reader's mind because Augustus wants him to, such as the defeat of Carthage, but he's not going to make it too close to what's going on. It's a little more subtle than that. So the way Virgil uses time is interesting. He makes the past into the present in the text, and part of that's because it's a founding story. It's about founding a nation. So these things shouldn't necessarily have happened yet. And that's another question that, even though it's not on the pedagogical or learning part, that you should think about, ruminate on, think about further, is how does Virgil use history and time throughout the text? Here are some of the passages that are really important. The first 13 lines of the book, at least in our translation of Book 1 in the poem, are some of the most important. I love the opening phrase. Worn a man I sing, in exile driven on by fate. In exile driven on by fate really shows Aeneas' plight and what's so interesting about it. And then worn a man I sing really shows how Virgil draws on both the Iliad and the Odyssey, because war is clearly one of the main themes of the Iliad, and then a man is the first line, the first word of the Odyssey, like I mentioned in the last lesson. And so it's about war and humanity, whereas previously, the Iliad focused more on war and the Odyssey focused more on humanity. So he's bringing the two together, so to speak, and I love the first line there. This next passage from Book 2 really shows how Aeneas is dutiful. Remember, that was an important point. This is where he refuses to leave his father as Troy is burning. The other passage from Book 2 is where it describes Ulysses when the Trojans first see the Trojan horse in Book 2. And so it really has that kind of negative view of Ulysses. And then this other passage from Book 1 gives the history of Dido, so that you can see the parallels to Cleopatra. And so these four passages reflect the four things we just discussed. I'll recap those for you quickly. Parallels to both the Iliad and the Odyssey would be the first one. Aeneas being a very dutiful character, and being dutiful was a new value for a protagonist at the time. How events are depicted very differently with kind of a different tone, even though they're similar events compared to the Iliad. And then the prominence and importance of Dido, her parallels to Cleopatra, how Virgil uses her in Carthage to evoke recent Roman history about the expansion of the empire. Those four things are four big takeaways from this text. And now that we're getting into the swing of things, that's what I'll try to do at the end of each lesson, is to use the quotations to recap 3 or 4 main points that we've just addressed by going through the questions together. Here are the pedagogical or learning questions that I'll ask you to answer on Canvas. So I'll give you a real brief context on each, but not answer them, so that you have plenty to say when you go to them. We already talked a lot about Dido. Remember, this is a time when patriarchy means male-dominated society. When it was just like ancient Greece, it was a patriarchal society. So women didn't have much power or autonomy or freedom or independence, and there was a double standard, and males were very powerful. So is the portrayal of Dido, positive or negative? And correspondingly, does it kind of support patriarchy or question or challenge patriarchy? Especially compared, if you watch it, can compare it to Penelope or earlier female figures we've seen. A really important thing with Dido's character is Aeneas' choice to abandon her. In some respects, it shows how dutiful he is, because he's obeying the gods when he does that. But she's racked with grief and kills herself, and she's a very sympathetic figure. So does that change our perception of him? Do we like him less? And ultimately, after that action, what do we think of him as a protagonist? Um, Imperialism is very important here. Imperialism is a theme we'll come back to throughout the course. Imperialism is the expansion of territory by seizing other territory through force, and usually implies rooting out the culture that's already there. So it's usually a very violent, gruesome thing where indigenous population is oppressed. And in the Iliad, or excuse me, in the Aeneid, Aeneas, in order to found the first Roman city, has to defeat the Latins, who are the native inhabitants of Italy. And the Roman Empire was still expanding at the time. So Augustus could have clearly commissioned Virgil to compose this very pro-imperialist text. But at the same time, it's difficult. It's keeping up an empire is very problematic, even for the colonizers, not just the colonized. And so I would say Virgil's tone towards imperialism is at best ambivalent. And that really comes through in Book 4 in Carthage. We don't have, in our anthology, I didn't assign you to read any of the books from Book 7 through 12, just for the sake of time, where you actually see Aeneas battle the Latins and found the city. But Dido is trying to found her own city when Aeneas shows up, and he completely throws it off by marrying her and then leaving. And so he doesn't actually marry her, but it's implied. Basically, she thinks they have. So that shows the cost of building empire on Dido. And so it's certainly pro-imperialist elements, but you can't say that it's solely pro-imperialist. And so I think that's a great complex question. And a lot of Western civilization was founded through imperialism. So that's a theme we'll come back to. Finally, this last question has to do with nation building. In what ways is nation building an important theme of the poem? As I said, it's one of the most prominent themes in the poem, and it really comes through in books 7 through 12, but you can certainly see it early on with Dido and Carthage. So for this final question, you can think about how she's trying to found a city and how Virgil's appearance there interferes with that. So remember, I always end with these important questions. What things are specific or unique to this text, and what about it transcends time and appeals to anyone, including you? And I'll just wrap up by kind of recapping real briefly. The Aeneid is the founding national epic for Rome, and Virgil draws on previous oral and literary traditions to create it. It's kind of like the first example of fan fiction in that he brings in these elements of the Greek poems, but he adds new elements by depicting the founding of a city.